I wanted to emphasize the fact that Audrey Jeffers was a pioneer in creating a space for women to function. So we start by looking at colonial Trinidad and Tobago, just very briefly. The heritage, the background of Audrey Jeffers, the formation and history of the Coterie of Social Workers, and creating a space for women's involvement in public life, and very briefly, the impact in the 21st century. Now, when we look back at colonial Trinidad and Tobago, we can look at some of the writings of people like Brathwaite, etc. And one thing is very clear. We are dealing with a highly stratified society, as took place in the rest of the Caribbean, on an inherited set of values coming out of the plantation experience. Now, Trinidad is a little peculiar in that early in the 1700s, definitely in the 1800s, you are seeing a certain number of, middle class of color. You're coming across lawyers, you're coming across different professionals, and it is not so apparent elsewhere. And one has to ask the question, how come? And I'm proposing that a lot of this is due to the fact that we were settled by the French Creoles, who would have brought in and applied a lot of the Code Noir, which was normative in the French territories. So that I think we first of all have to understand that even though we are dealing with a highly stratified society, we are dealing with a society where there is an African descended, very often mulatto, middle class. And that's important. Now, when we come to the 1900s and we see the return of persons from the First World War, something else is significant. The best known probably is Captain Cipriani, who becomes a member of the Legislative Council and later becomes Mayor of Port of Spain. But other people are coming back. And as you will discover later on in the presentation, Audrey Jeffers is one of those people who comes back from the First World War. Now, the environment to which she returns is an environment which is basically male-dominated. Like in doing my research, I discovered that there was a social welfare organization. And they were concerned, it was, run by Englishmen, and they were concerned about sailors, they were concerned about dance halls. It's the first time I saw dance halls in relation to Trinidad. I thought dance hall was a Jamaican term, but it was used here in Trinidad. And even in social welfare, social development issues, you don't get the impression that it was as female-dominated as it is today. It was you're looking at a male-dominated society, and the importance of skin color. The lighter you are, very often was linked to the place, because we were dealing with an ascribed system. However, there is that a little anomaly where you have people of color and some fairly dark complexioned who are already in the middle class and are professionals. Now, the poverty has not yet been documented. T.S. Saimi, Lord Moyne, they're going to talk about the poverty later on in the century. However, malnutrition, illiteracy, non-representation of women, lack of adult suffrage. We only have our first set of elections in 1947. And slum housing is the norm. So this is the society in the early 1900s. Now, she is born in 1896, and at 18 she goes to England. I presume to study. You know, we aren't told, but we know that while she is in England, she does complete some studies. She returns after World War I and sets as a goal to improve the conditions of persons, especially the poor, in Trinidad and Tobago. She's born into an Anglican family, and this is significant because later on we are going to discover how the Anglican Church recognizes her in the 21st century. Unlike most people of African descent at the time, especially dark-complexioned people, she is from a wealthy family. Her father is what we call in Trinidad a small islander, or of small islander parents, and he is a wealthy lawyer, owning significant number of properties within Port of Spain. She's born on Baden-Powell Street, and she moves to a residence, Briar End, in St. Clair, now opposite the Queen's Park Oval. And in this location, we can realize that it's the beginning of interaction with a lot of the elite of Trinidad. Now, at the time, I don't want to give you the impression it was an always one, right? It was not that from what I understand. But there was more social interaction across races once you were in a particular class level. And her family apparently was a very social family, so that there would be visitors to the home. Her father as a lawyer, there would be other lawyers coming by, and there would be many discussions about what is taking place. I discovered that there were quite a few vacation homes. One, she went to Tranquility, because that was the only school available at the time. Convent was the other school in existence for girls, but they were restricted to Roman Catholic girls. And interestingly enough, this is the school that Eric Williams went to as primary school. And she leaves to study in England in 1914, and we have evidence that she came back with a certificate of health, and also evidence that she did some training in social science. What I think may have marked her the most is her informal exposure. Nowhere do you see this documented, but when you start to add up one on one and you look at what is taking place at the time she's in England, and then you read some of the newspaper articles about the things she's saying, like she's supposed to say, you must vote for a woman, put a woman in charge, you know, there's this newspaper article, Audrey's solution for everything, put a woman in charge. And a lot of feminist, you know, feminist rhetoric, a lot of feminist talking. But where is this coming from? Because it certainly isn't coming from Trinidad, you know, from her exposure in Trinidad. So I have put in that she had to have been exposed to the women's movement. She also, we know, and we have evidence of this, that she served with West African soldiers who were part of the war. And I was just learning before this session that she was also willing in the Second World War to assist Black American soldiers, and being criticized for that. But she clearly had some sensitivity to issues of race, even though she never discussed it. And never, I mean, growing up, I never thought of her as being someone promoting Africanism or anything like that. But look at the sort of experiences she would have had. The other experience I suspect she had is that of Pan-Africanism, being promoted by Sylvester Williams. Sylvester Williams was in England around the same time. And those of you who've studied or lived abroad, you know what happens when we get there. You hear there's a Trinidadian somewhere down there, and you all meet and you get in touch. And you become the best of friends for the period of time that you're there abroad. Okay? It doesn't matter what race, at least in the old days, I understand it's changed now. But up until my time of studying abroad, it didn't matter if the person was Chinese, white, Indian, they were Trinidadian. And they came and looked for you. You were the new kid in town, and you, in your turn, looked out for them when you heard a Trinidadian was around. So that I am sure she was exposed to Sylvester Williams and a lot of what he was teaching. And I feel that is so for two reasons. I discovered that one of the mottos of the Coterie was actually taken from a Black American women's group. So she was sensitive to issues of race. The other thing, her nephew, Tony Martin, is a staunch Pan-Africanist. So what was happening in the household? You know, his grandparents' household. So these are the three influences that I see playing out in her work. I was at Toko, and I had the privilege of talking to people who had been to the Toko country house, and apparently she would take friends down there from time to time. And also they had down the islands, at least one down the islands home. So that we are not dealing with your typical Trinidadian of the era. Very important is her relationship with her parents. Because so many West Indians carry pain in them about, especially relationships with fathers. You know, a couple of weekends ago, I was sitting, and a friend, sharing that pain of having to deal with her father, and her father married someone else than her mother. But the whole relationship and the years of pain and going through. And we know the situation of boy children and the pain they have with their fathers, whether or not they are legitimate or illegitimate. Somehow, they did not play this out from all information in her family. The parents seem to have gotten along well with her, and she got along well with them from all the evidence I have found. I started to dig a little deeper because it was sounding too good to be true, especially for that generation, where fathers are supposed to be more distant. And so if he was distant, he was generous, right? But from the people who knew her and knew the mother, they are saying that the mother, like one person told me, her mother had said that the Jeffers, were a special kind of people, and when they're giving things, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. It was always done quietly, and that they were very generous people, very kind, and so on. So that relationship with her parents and her mother setting an example of charity and good works. I think these are some of the influences that helped to make her the woman that she became. We begin to see very early that she has a vision of women being involved in society. And she initially starts with the Coterie of Social Workers, but she goes on later on, and she starts the Caribbean Women's Association, the Caribbean Women's Federation in Guyana, Sir Optimus International, which is still functioning, Rigsby talks about it, and she says it was started by Audrey Jeffers as the first Caribbean branch of Soroptimists in the region. And again, this is why I'm thinking she must have been exposed to the women's movement, because she keeps talking about the importance of women being involved in society. Now, what is happening in Trinidad around 1921 and before, and maybe a little after? What are the social services on the scene? We already have the children's homes, which have been established in the 1800s. That is St. Mary's, St. Dominic's, St. Michael's, and St. Jude. Those are already on the scene. We have Bishop Anstey, who is the Anglican bishop, and he pioneers a school that I feel very close to, and I see some ex-bishopians around. Yes. How many of you went to Bishops? Oh, all the old people? No, not the old people. Okay. Well, he starts, Bishop Anstey, actually the same year the Coterie started. But he also goes on to promote education in Trinidad. And I understand in order to raise money, he does not live at Hayes Court. He lives somewhere, and I think he rents out Hayes Court so that there is money to fund these different services. The League of Social Welfare, this is what I was talking about earlier on. I never heard of this. It's not documented in any of the reports on social welfare. However, when you read the newspapers, you would see in 1920s they're having meetings, that they're declaring this, that this is going to be their area of concern, so, you know, so that they were clearly active around that time. Child Welfare League, which is still with us today, and which has given birth to Choices. You're familiar with Choices, where unwed mothers, teenage mothers can go and get training and so on. St. Vincent de Paul, again, my research is indicating this may be our oldest voluntary organization in the country. They come in 1857. It's a group of nuns who come in to deal with an epidemic that we're having in Trinidad. So that is what is on the scene at the time. We also have, but I don't really include it as a social service, Field Naturalists Club, which starts at the end of the 1800s and is one of the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. So that in 1921, when the Coterie is being started, it is coming into that environment. Informally, people are having their little susu, women. That is how women are able to get money and purchase their chairs and their tables and their beds for their houses. You're doing a susu, and you all know what susu is because it still exists. You put in a susu, and then you get, you know, your hand, and you can use it to purchase something. And gayak, you want to build a house, you can't afford to pay for labor, and all your neighbors come and you sing, you chant, and you build your house. What is going on in the other territories at the time? You're going to find elsewhere the state had a more active role in social welfare provision. So that before the 1900s, some of our colonies had already adaptations of Elizabethan poor law. But it was only for the free poor, which means, therefore, that slaves didn't qualify. And it would have been, therefore, for the poor whites. And I asked myself, why is the state so active in the other countries, other Anglophone countries, but not in Trinidad? And the reason for it is that it's quite 1797 that we become British. So it takes some time, you know, to anglicize the country and to bring in these different institutions. Guyana already has the Poor Relief Act. Barbados, the Poor Man's Board and Settlement of the Poor Act. Jamaica has schools run by different religions, an orphanage, a hospital, and this is a combination of church and state. The Salvation Army is worth noting. In Trinidad, we find that they are beginning to do work with probationers. In the other territories, they have already a school for the blind, hostels, and they're very concerned about discharged prisoners. The charity organization Society, which is more or less the forerunner of social workers, actually develops a chapter in Jamaica. But I have found no evidence that any such thing was taking place in Trinidad. And therefore, you see work in the other territories to eliminate begging, assist the deserving poor, not the worthless poor, the deserving poor, and the beginning of the practice of casework. No evidence of any such thing in Trinidad. Audrey Jeffers recognizes that there are social problems in the era. And with the assistance of her friends, hence the name the Coterie, you know, it's a group of women coming together for a particular goal, and her parents, she has what I consider to be the first thing we see on record of what today we would call a social policy seminar. Right, where they sat down and they talked about what were the problems of the society and started to develop responses towards it. And this seminar, it lasted, I understand, a week. Todd talks about this seminar at her Down the Islands home, at her father's beach house. And there they were identifying specific problems and proposing responses to these problems. So they decided to form an organization of social workers, and with the objective to cultivate, stimulate, and promote voluntary service for the progress of the community in general. And the groups they wanted to target were women, the needy, children, and the infirm. So that from the beginning, this was the target group that the Coterie set out to help. It was a woman's organization. Not to say that men couldn't come and help, but she was very clear it was a woman's organization in a patriarchal society. She's standing up, she's not borrowing an organization from abroad like Girl Guides or anything. She is saying in 1921, we women are starting an organization to help the needy in our society. And membership was only open to women. She allowed women to become self-assertive, to stand up and speak out. She encouraged their intellectual development and for them to begin to intervene in social matters. Now, we have to understand the significance of this in 1921. It's going to be in the 1939 that the Social Welfare Department gets started. After the recommendations of the Moyne Commission. It's 1990 that professional social work education begins in Trinidad and Tobago. 70 years before, Audrey Jeffers recognizes the need for social intervention, and she would have these different seminars to educate and to help to improve the members' understanding of what they needed to do. So that in 1921, Jeffers and her members were strategists for change, intervention, and maintained a space for women who wished to serve and influence society. With the widespread poverty in Trinidad and Tobago, she recognizes that there is need for a social welfare response. This is before the West Indian Commission of the 1930s. This is before, as I pointed out, the teaching of social work, even in Jamaica, right? Because there is a group that started in Jamaica, it's now linked to the university, but they would do short courses, and they are coming off the ground somewhere maybe in the 1960s, okay? And our people are going up there to be trained. We have no documentation, and she did not document the kind of poverty, malnutrition, and housing squalor. She was just talking. And this is something that we have to watch in our region, because we do a lot of work and we give excellent speeches. We do not write. So that when those who come afterwards are looking for material, you know, after the people have died and we have not written. And I think that is one of my motivations for getting some writing done, because I realized that there was so much material, so much had taken place, but where is it documented? And so the first person to really give us some good documentation will be T.S. Saimi, and of course the West Indian Commission. However, that organization that was started in 1921 remains the best known indigenous local social service to survive. It's still functioning today. So what were some of the activities that the Coterie promoted? The rights of women. They were talking about women's rights. I have a link, an ancestral link with the Coterie, and I remember in the, boy, it must have been somewhere in the 60s. It would have to have been in the 60s. A lot of discussion about the rights of women to file independent tax forms. You know, I remember that discussion in the home. And part of it must have been coming from the Coterie. That discussion about women having, you know, their own to file their own income tax, married women. The girls' scholarship, well, that was promoted apparently by Audrey Jeffers. A scholarship for girls, because boys used to get all the scholarships. And they were few and far between, maybe 2 or 3 a year. And it always went to the boys' schools. And Audrey Jeffers advocated and said, look here, there must be a scholarship for girls. Employment opportunities for women. We discovered that she pushed for there to be female policewomen. And one of the people who became one of the first policewomen, she then committed herself to Coterie. She felt that there should be some representation. Women should be on boards, on different things. You know, that women, we have a voice. You know, why is it we don't get any representation? Something which has impressed me so much, because I have now become a member of the Coterie in recent years, is the self-reliance in fundraising. Coterie right now does not get a subvention, and Coterie is functioning. They have regular fundraisers, and then, we'll talk about this later, the school feeding that they initiated, some branches, not all branches, some branches when the government took it over, again on the recommendation of a Coterie member, decided, okay, government doing that, we don't need to do it. But some kept the school feeding, and they work on contract to the government. Community care for the disabled. And then I came across an article which talked about Audrey Jeffers going into Laventille. And she is saying that we have to show the people in Laventille that we are there for them. These are our sisters, and this is when she goes to start a day nursery. And she says, you know, people in Laventille we have to make it clear that, you know, we are in solidarity. She didn't use the term in solidarity. That's the language we would use maybe in the 60s, because we're in the 40s. But it's that kind of meaning she's giving. Community care for the disabled. And then I came across an article which talked about Audrey Jeffers going into Laventille. And she is saying that we have to show the people in Laventille that we are there for them. These are our sisters, and this is when she goes to start a day nursery. And she says, you know, people in Laventille we have to make it clear that, you know, we are in solidarity. She didn't use the term in solidarity. That's the language we would use maybe in the 60s, because we're in the 40s. But it's that kind of meaning she's giving. Community care for the disabled. And then I came across an article which talked about Audrey Jeffers going into Laventille. And she is saying that we have to show the people in Laventille that we are there for them. These are our sisters, and this is when she goes to start a day nursery. And she says, you know, people in Laventille we have to make it clear that, you know, we are in solidarity. She didn't use the term in solidarity. That's the language we would use maybe in the 60s, because we're in the 40s. But it's that kind of meaning she's giving. By and large, they are self-reliant. They function mainly with voluntary action. So that, for example, I'm chairperson, you're in charge of this building, you're making sure all the different programs do, it's all voluntary work. The different committees all function as volunteers. So that, like, there's a committee that runs a Come Read With Me program, where they bus children in from Beetham Gardens and from one or two of the children's homes, and they help them to read. It's called Come Read With Me, and the whole purpose is to improve their level of reading. And they work very closely with Excel School in Beetham. But the people running it, they are giving up their Saturdays every Saturday for and they don't even get thank you, you know. They give up their Saturdays and they do it. And Coterie originally started with voluntary action. So the school feeding, maybe the cooks would be paid, but basically a lot of it used to be in colonial times, a lot of donations, and you're going because you had housewives with maids. So they would go in, help cook the food, or some would go in afterwards, you know, go to the home for the aged or something in the afternoon and volunteer their time. In an era where Roman Catholics who took communion outside of the Roman Catholic Church would get excommunicated. Coterie women would get together, they have their communion together, they pray together, they praise their God together, and is Methodist, Roman Catholic, Baptist, whatever. Majority Anglican. But these women are getting together, and as far as they're concerned, they talk about the Creator. They all respect the Creator, and they praise in their God together. And Christ said, do this in remembrance of me, and they're sharing together in remembrance of Christ. And who don't like it, that's their problem. So ecumenical worship, which we take for granted now, you know, every time we're having an interreligious organization or interreligious ceremony to start everything, it wasn't like that before. What she is best known for is the school feeding program, which began in 1926 with the breakfast shed. And the aim of it was to provide a balanced cooked midday meal for school children at a penny a day. And if they couldn't afford it, they could come and eat freely. What we have discovered is that a lot of people in society, remember I said that Coterie is still self-sufficient, and a lot of people in society ate at the breakfast shed. So sometimes, like some of the older members, you know, they want to go to, say, a government ministry, and the San Fernando branch has recently been rebuilt, you know, for school feeding. But when they reach to the ministry and they're talking to X, Y, or Z, and they say they're from the Coterie, they said, but you know, I used to eat Coterie food. And therefore, you get a better reception. Because I am amazed, apparently, a lot of people in this society in the 40s and 30s needed Coterie food as late as the 60s. A lot of what today are fairly prominent people ate Coterie food. And that was done essentially by volunteers. I've put in Layne Arnett's name here because she has recently died. But she's just one example of the volunteers who used to keep it going. I don't have the names of the earlier ones, but I want them acknowledged. It's not just Layne Arnett. These were women who would come in, leave their homes, come in, work, and then maybe go back in the afternoon, or in the afternoon come in. I understand, like Layne Arnett, somebody was telling me she would come and she would make sandwiches. You know, come every day religiously, make sandwiches. If there is some problem that the hot food isn't ready, you know there would be sandwiches there. Layne Arnett would have done it. This program was actually the forerunner and prototype for this National School Feeding Program. Now, with independence and the establishment of the school feeding program, you have to function according to particular standards. You have to pay minimum wages, or whatever wage. You have health standards to conform to. And not to say that they didn't, obey it, but I mean, there are regulations. And you have to have, like Barataria recently had to do over the whole kitchen in keeping with the new regulations. According to the last president, look, it's businesses we are running now, and we have to understand that. You have to run it like a business in the post-independence. So that today, that school nutrition program is feeding 44,000 breakfasts, 97,000 lunches, and it's going to preschools, primary, secondary schools, and special schools. Only 3 branches of the Coterie still continue school feeding. However, the program was proposed to Parliament by Louise Horn, who was a Coterie member, and Eric Williams was sympathetic towards it, and therefore it became reality. Today, disability is the in thing, right? And there's a disability unit, which was just started the other day. Social care for persons with long-term needs has always been there, and you're looking at the elderly, the mentally challenged, persons with physical disabilities. In 1928, Coterie started the St. Mary's Home for Blind Women. That no longer exists. I think it was maybe the end of the last century. They could not pay. They couldn't afford to pay the staff. A lot of the volunteers had died. You know, the people who would come in the afternoon, read to the women, comb their hair, spend time with the women. And then to the blind, by this time you have the Blind Institute. The blind are all going to school and are becoming fairly self-reliant. So you don't have this body of elderly women who need somewhere to stay. She lobbied for government to start to train people in disability. So Lydia Harper, who was the first person to be trained to work with the deaf, was also a Coterie member. And she got that training, and she continued and she promoted, education for the deaf in Trinidad. Now today you have a lot of schools. Most of them started in the 50s, like Lady Ho Choi's School, different homes for the elderly, and there's a school for the deaf in South, which was actually named after Audrey Jeffers. Hostels for working women. Now this is something which many of you are going to have a little bit of difficulty understanding. But after World War I, for the first time, we as women started to have our own businesses, seamstresses. We start to work. Then, of course, there are the teachers, there are the nurses, etc. And if we are living in the country, how are you getting to ply your trade? You want to be a hairdresser, you need to come to town and leave your parents' home. How do you think a girl who gets up and leaves her parents' home in 1920-something and 1930-something is going to be seen? She come to town to look for. Right? So that in order to support women to be able to hold a job and to practice their trade, whether they were seamstresses, store clerks, nurses were provided often with housing, and teachers often got housing when they were traveling. But for the other women, like hairdressers, seamstresses, persons who want to start a little shop, so that in order to support the economically independent woman and allow her to gain some independence, the Coterie decided to offer respectable, safe, comfortable housing for working women. Now they paid a rent, and one of these houses still exists at Anstey Guest House. And I mean, they can get rooms there, all kind of $400 in Woodbrook. Right? There's a little studio, I think it's about $600 for the month. And working women can still go there. You share like a big stove, big fridge, two or so fridges, two or so stoves, microwave, that kind of thing. But it allows you to have safe housing in Port of Spain and not have to be in, one of these dumps or sharing a room with people you ain't really know and don't care too much for, and a certain sense of respectability and comfort. And today we have other hostels like that, YWCA, St. Vincent de Paul Hostel for Working Men. The first recorded daycare center is at John John, and this is when she's talking about giving support to the people in Laventille. And the Coterie then later opened other services at San Fernando and Barataria. And today daycare centers are normative. But this was started at a time when, women needed that support in order to go out and work. I inquired about the John John Day Nursery. Apparently, by the 1980s, it got vandalized. And it was supposed to have been handed to the government. And the government said they will build something there. A lot of the Coterie members at that time no longer felt comfortable going back into Lavendale. They felt very different from Audrey Jeffers' time, where they were deprived areas, but Audrey Jeffers said, we need to give support to our sisters. Celebration of Mother's Day. It's the Coterie that introduced Mother's Day to Trinidad and Tobago. It was already celebrated internationally, and it was introduced in 1927. And in the past, they used to choose a Mother of the Year. And this continues today, where poor mothers, not on Mother's Day, but the week after Mother's Day, you have food hampers and they get a lovely meal. Entertainment is provided for them. And that continues at Audrey Jeffers' house in Port of Spain to this day. Another thing about Coterie is that they recognize the need for the poor to have leisure time. That you're not only dealing with food and housing, but you need recreation, entertainment. And apparently there were regular evenings of entertainment for the elderly and needy children from the institutions. Then they also had to raise funds to provide these programs. And I got evidence from the newspaper of a moonlight excursion down the islands in the 30s. You know how all of us have fete now around Carnival? Apparently, people didn't realize that Monday night was a good night for Carnival fete. So long before all these fetes came into being, Coterie was having a Monday night Carnival fete. Then, of course, there's Fête de Noël, the Christmas Bazaar, the Palm Sunday concert, which still exists. And these sorts of activities have now become regular practice for so many organizations. There's so many boats now going on different cruises down the islands. All the bands have their Monday night fete. Christmas is a normative thing, a Christmas bazaar. And the competition became so much that Coterie could no longer pull in children for their Christmas bazaar because all the schools were having Christmas bazaars. And so they had to downsize to a T, which has its own clientele. Advocacy for children and women, a youth camp for girls, and encouraging women to participate in political life, pushing for children's rights in the 1960s, junior Coterie. We're trying very hard to revitalize. We're having a lot of problems because young people are so busy these days, you know. They have lessons, they have this. But Zalea Hassan Ali, she said that she got initiated into social work in the junior Coterie as a member of the junior Coterie. Nesta Patrick has said the same thing, that her first exposure was in the junior Coterie. More recently, after independence, you're seeing things like literacy. I told you about the Come Read With Me program. When it applied supervision of children attending shift schools. You remember when they had the morning shift and evening shift? So to prevent the development of delinquency, they offered a service where if you were on evening shift, you came in the morning to the Coterie, and if you were on morning shift, you came in the afternoon. Computer literacy for the elderly, that hasn't been able to be continued, and we now have a senior citizen center in Barataria. And then quietly children are supported with school books and transportation. The most recent was they made a collection among members of the Coterie for the children who were affected by the Diego Martin. Those who were in the shelters, you know, the Diego Martin floods. Well, everybody was providing food and mattresses, and so Coterie said, we will make sure that those who are in the in the camping center who've lost their houses, that they go back to school. And I think about 10 children were outfitted back to school by Coterie. No publicity. Nobody knows. Celebration of Universal Children's Day continues every year with the children from the children's homes. They learn about children's rights, etc. Ecumenical action, I've spoken about that. And that also we need to recognize that she served in various areas of the Anglican Church, and the church respected her. What is the motivation behind all of this? The Coterie's philosophy, lift as we climb. We are moving up in society, but we help to bring people up in our society. The organization is founded on the belief that the Creator demands our concern for the welfare of one's fellow man. The administrative structure which has survived to the 21st century, there's a national executive with representatives from all the branches. The headquarters is at Audrey Jeffers' house, 3 London Street, and that she was the executive director for 47 years. And after her death, they divided her position into 2. One was a president who remained a volunteer, and then they got an executive director. At branch level, you have the chairperson, project committee members, treasurer, secretary. Volunteer service, it still continues, and the sense of philanthropy. I think sometime I or somebody else needs to do something on the philanthropy of West Indian women. Because we give. We often give, and we don't publicize it anywhere. And so much so that for the Haiti Red Cross, the Haiti earthquake, the 210 earthquake, Coterie members from their pocket gave a total of $25,000. Most members are still quite old, are now quite old, and that average of 70 includes, when you average it out, the 50-something-year-olds. So a lot of members can't come back out, they're 90. I think we honored 3 centenarians. Political and public life. She's the first woman, 1936, elected a member of City Council, member of Legislative Council, honorary consul for Liberia. You see that link with West Africa. Encouraging Coterie members to get involved in political life. So we have Verna Kitcher, Dame Louise Horn. The Anglican Church recognizes her, I think in 2010, by having a day set aside for her in the Anglican calendar. And it's the first time any such Trinidadian is so honored. The Anglican Church doesn't give saints, but she is recognized, you know, within the diocese of the Anglican Church. Feminist inspiration and actions. There are Coterie members who to this day will tell you, you know, I was inspired by Audrey Jeffers, or the Coterie isn't doing what it's supposed to do. This is not what Audrey Jeffers meant. You know, she is still inspiring people. Right? And you know, they're still getting vexed with the organization. Some of the older ones, you know. No, we're not supposed to be a business. You know, we are supposed to be doing voluntary work. And so that vision, these are the different types of recognition that she got. She received an MBA and OBE, Coronation Medal, Humanist Service, Chaconia Medal posthumously, and of course the Highway. She died on June 24th, 1968 at 70. She was recognized. When you read the newspaper articles at her death, the mother of social services, the Guardian calls her. Near Hamilton Holder, a noble woman, nobly planned, to warm, to comfort and command. A woman who demonstrated the difference that one person can make in effecting the evolution of a society. We have no evidence of a comparable woman in the Anglophone Caribbean before 1940. Thank you.
Well, So we'd like to thank Dr. Cambridge for her very thorough presentation. She went through the entire history of social services in Trinidad and Tobago and how Audrey Jeffers inspired that type of giving within our community. And we often hear about Trinidad and Tobago being a paternalistic society, and it gives the impression that women are uninvolved. But when we look behind the scenes, it's women who are movers and shakers, and this is a very, very explicit example.